whether it's Afghanistan, Ukraine, now Israel on 10/7, or Israel after Iran's fusillade, it's always never escalate, always de-escalate. I think this is actually in a situation where Israel has to step in to the position that the United States used to hold, which is to lead the West.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish news syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. We're continuing our JNS coverage of the war on Israel that was launched by Hamas on October 7th and the surge in anti-Semitism in the United States with a conversation with radio talk show host and law professor Hugh Hewitt to talk about both U.S.-Israel relations, foreign policy, as well as the 2024 election. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You could find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Spotify, Google Play, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, by going to jns.org or Telegram and subscribing. And now to today's program. What is the goal of American foreign policy in the fourth year of Joe Biden's presidency? Is it to strengthen ties with allies and ensure for a more prosperous and secure world for America and its friends and fellow democracies? Or is it to merely appease hostile forces like Iran and to hope that Tehran and its terrorist allies and auxiliaries can be bought off with bribes and restraint? For the last 6 months since the October 7th massacres committed by Hamas, the president and his foreign policy team have been speaking out of both sides of their mouth about these questions and taking contradictory actions that have sown confusion among friend and foe alike. From the moment he took office in January 2021, Biden seemed intent on reviving his old boss Barack Obama's policy of appeasing Iran and attempting a rapprochement with the world's leading state sponsor of terror. While that effort never succeeded in creating a new version of Obama's dangerously weak Iran nuclear deal, the relaxation of sanctions and the creation of more daylight between the U.S. and Israel, as well as moderate Arab nations like Saudi Arabia, not only enriched and empowered Iran, it also put a halt to the momentum that had been created towards a wider circle of Middle East peace by his predecessor Donald Trump's Abraham Accords. The full consequences of that mistake were felt not only as Iran got closer to getting nuclear weapons. The events of October 7th, as Hamas committed barbaric atrocities in its assault on southern Israel, not only launched a new chapter of bloodshed in the history of the region, but also made clear the consequences of appeasing Iran and strengthening its ability to aid its terrorist allies. While Biden's initial support for Israel's war to defend its existence and eradicate a genocidal terrorist movement was commendable, he almost immediately began to back away from that stand as left-wing critics bashed him for being too supportive of the Jewish state. Over the last 6 months, the president and his re-election and foreign policy teams have become convinced that dissent from the leftist intersectional base of the Democratic Party that despises Israel will lead to his defeat in November. That's why he's pivoted to a stance in which his only priority is to end the fighting in Gaza, even if it means granting a victory to Hamas. He threatens aid cuts to Israel if it dares to finish the job of defeating the terrorists, but still seeks to pass an aid bill granting it more assistance, though only because coupling it with aid to Ukraine, which is fighting a war about which he is more enthusiastic, will enable Kyiv to be assisted. He mobilized U.S. forces to help defend Israel against Iranian missiles, something for which Israel and its friends are grateful, but then demands that Israel again show restraint and not hit back against Iran, thus also ensuring that anti-Israel and anti-Western forces won't be deterred from more attacks. His is a foreign policy based not on principle or even a defense of U.S. interests, but only on his own short-term political priorities, even if those are based on misperceptions of the American electorate, where far more votes may be lost in the center for abandoning Israel than on the left for being insufficiently hostile to the Jewish state. Such stands are not only bad politics, they are also terrible policies, which are convincing America's foes that Washington is weak, something that can only lead to more violence. To discuss this further, we're very fortunate to have with us today one of the smartest and most articulate observers of American foreign policy and politics today. Hugh Hewitt is the host of The Hugh Hewitt Show, heard weekday mornings from 6 to 9 a.m. on the Salem Radio Network and simulcast on Salem News Channel. It is heard on over 400 affiliates nationwide and on all the streaming platforms where SNC can be seen. He's a frequent guest on Fox News Channel. He has also been a professor of law at Chapman University's Fowler School of Law since 1996, where he teaches constitutional law. He's the author of several books, including The Queen, The Epic Ambition of Hillary, The Happiest Life, 7 Gifts, 7 Givers, and The Secret to Genuine Success, and The Brief Against Obama, The Rise, Fall, and Epic Fail of the Hope and Change Presidency. Hugh Hewitt, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
Oh, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you if you think there is a consistent theme to President Biden's foreign policy. He certainly seems to have been speaking out of both sides of his mouth about Israel and Iran for the last 3+ years, but especially the last 6 months since October 7th. Is it about reviving the Obama legacy, something slightly different, or merely a reaction to what he perceived as his domestic political problems?
I think it's 3 answers, Jonathan. It is part of the Obama legacy because there are people around him who are heavily invested in the defunct JCPOA. Part of it is his domestic political situation, as you just mentioned, but it's also the president always seems to have an 8-track tape, and I'm dating him and myself there, in the back of his head, calling up old responses to old controversies, which are absolutely not applicable here. And the dome over all of those 3 things is never escalate. Never escalate. And whether it's Afghanistan, Ukraine, now Israel on 10/7, or Israel after Iran's fusillade, it's always never escalate, always de-escalate.
Right. What do you think will be the consequences for both the region and the U.S. if, as he seems to be demanding, that Israel ends the war in Gaza before Hamas is completely defeated?
That would be a disaster, as great a disaster as not responding ×2 to what Iran did on Saturday night. And I think this is actually in a situation where Israel has to step in to the position that the United States used to hold, which is to lead the West, at least for a period of time. I saw that Foreign Minister David Cameron is coming to Israel tomorrow, on the day after we tape this. And I can't think of a worse person to represent the West right now than David Cameron. And I can't, Israel can't ever say no to anyone. They have to take every phone call. They have to pretend to listen. But I am really looking to Israel to lead the West, at least in this next few months, because Joe Biden is incapable of it. Rishi Sunak is incapable of it. I don't know any of this. So like Zelensky has had to lead the West in Ukraine.
I guess the question there is, Biden spent his first 3 years in office trying to appease Iran, trying to revive, as you say, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. That didn't quite work, but he was still, ending sanctions, still sending the unfreezing money, just, very recently sending them another $10 billion. But what do you, and again, it's sort of like contradiction. He's helping defend Israel, but also doing everything to stop Israel from hitting back at Iran to show them that they can't get away with this. What do you think Tehran makes of these contradictions?
I think that they think we are being led by an infirm president, easily influenced by Secretary Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan. The triumvirs are Blinken, but he's infirm. And I don't want to insult him. but I'm 68, so I'll be at 81 before too long. And I don't want anyone to take my car keys away. I just don't think he's capable of absorbing the new world that we're living in. And Tehran has figured it out, Putin, and especially Xi has figured it out, that with an infirm president, now is the time to take a mark. I mean, I cannot believe what happened on Saturday night. It would never have happened with Donald Trump, my personal opinion. It wouldn't have happened with George W. Bush in 1,000 years. I don't even think it would have happened under Obama, because President Obama had not yet made this transition to the Ben Rhodes world of Iran must be a regional power with whom we must deal as an equal. And they're not. They're theocrats. They're fanatics. I think we can deal with Xi on he's a communist Leninist, and we know that. Putin is a dictator thug. But Iran and Khamenei is a religious zealot, as are the Hamas Sunni zealots, as opposed to the Shia zealots. And it doesn't make any sense to the people currently, what I call the model UN national security team. They're used to running debate clubs and everything gets resolved in the end and they turn in their term paper. That's not who we're dealing with, Jonathan. Do you agree with me on that they don't quite grasp the nature of this regime?
Oh, as hard as it is to accept that, because these are, it's true that Biden has been wrong about everything for the last half century, as, former Defense Secretary Gates once said about him. But, it's hard to grasp the idea that he really thinks that Iran wants to, in Obama's words, get right with the world. Not after everything that has happened, but yet that's the way he's acting. Just as, but again, there's so many contradictions here. After October 7th, he says, he agrees with Israel, Hamas must be eradicated, but now he's trying to save Hamas. He's helping defend Israel, but then saying, leave Iran alone. So I certainly see an ideological strain in what, sort of Tony Blinken, is about. It's classic Obama foreign policy, about changing America's orientation, a rapprochement with Iran, downgrading Israel and the Saudis. But yet he wants to have it both ways. That's the interesting thing about this for me, in that it's not entirely consistent. He keeps veering back and forth. And I think in some ways that's even more dangerous because, any student of history will tell you wars and violence happen when powers misperceive each other, when they either underestimate or overestimate each other. And when we have a president and a foreign policy that, is all over the place and is perceived as weak, certainly after Afghanistan, anything is possible. And in the last 6 months, basically anything has happened.
Yeah, your old friend, John Podhoretz, today on the commentary podcast I listened to before coming on, was talking how we're kind of back in 1968 moment, the creation of the Weatherman moment. And I was nodding to myself because my first job out of college was working for Richard Nixon in the Elba of America in San Clemente during the Iranian Revolution. And so 50 years ago, the Iranian Revolution, or 45 years ago, the Iranian Revolution is happening. And Jimmy Carter didn't grasp it, right? He did not understand it because it was not on his map that the Ayatollah Khomeini is out of deeply medievalism, as is Khamenei. And after Hamas on 10/7, you would think they would understand we're not dealing with a regular adversary. We're dealing with religious fanatics, and we have to relearn. They're not going to negotiate. They'll take the money. They took the money, but we're not going to get anything back from them that requires and I think if people will focus on the fact they believe it's a mandate from God to destroy Israel and then the United States, if they will just believe that, they'll begin to understand what we're up against, meaning the West, us, what we are up against. And the tip of our spear happens to be Israel. So that is, I say on the radio this morning, Jonathan, I was sitting with Richard Nixon in the old Western White House, along with Ray Price, in this period of time, and he could shake his head. He's a disgraced, exiled president. And he knew that when the Shah fell, this was extraordinarily bad. And he wrote about it in the book I was working on, The Real War. And he understood from the get-go that the Shah was a defense against this. Our friends in the Democratic Party, and maybe I don't know what your partisan nature is, I'm a Republican, Our friends in the Democratic Party, and especially on the squad, do not understand this. It's not stupidity, it's ignorance. They have not done their work. They have not done their reading.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true that there's a lot of ignorance on the left. I also think there is a resistance to moral clarity. Now, there's a certain irony because certainly Joe Biden seems to only speak in hyperbole when he's talking about domestic politics. I mean, he's very big on demonizing his foes. We can get to that a little bit later when we turn to the 2024 election. But it seems to me one of the great divides, certainly after October 7th, is, disregarding people who are just openly pro-Hamas, just open anti-Semitism, and we've seen a lot of that, is that there are a lot of people whose main reaction to something that, to me, ought to inspire moral clarity, this is good and evil, these are bad things, we have to see it clearly, is to say, no, nuance. It can't be that Israel is just in the right here. They have to also be in the wrong. And I think that leads to confusion about how to deal with forces that are really not morally nuanced. Hamas is not morally nuanced. Iran's influence and its ambitions are not morally nuanced. And yet, so much of our public discourse it seems to center around, certainly in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, seems to center on resistance against moral clarity.
I think you are 100% right. Earlier this week, in one of the places I write for over at Fox News, I point out there's a clarity window that opens only rarely. It opened on 10/8. We had moral clarity. Then that window begins to shut rather quickly. On Saturday night, we had moral clarity. And what I can't get over is speed kills bad guys. But taking your time, going step by step, doing the Model UN approach and having a special rapporteur, that does not work with theological madmen. And you've just got to punch them in the nose as hard as necessary. In the case of Gaza, they actually have to finish the job in Rafah. Former President Trump was a guest of mine 2 weeks ago. And although I speak Trump, I don't know if you speak Trump, but I speak Trump. Took him a long time to get there, but he said victory, the V word. Israel needs victory. And he also said we have to finish the job. Now, he had been misinterpreted by some conservative Jewish journalists from Israel, not someone secular, but actually I believe they were religious Zionists, and they understood him to be more ambiguous. I don't understand him to be ambiguous at all. I think he thinks Israel got to win. He just wants them to hurry up because I think Trump's a developer. He understands speed is necessary to win.
Yeah, well, first I want to thank you for citing my column in your question to him in that interview.
Yep.
I think you're right. Trump, he's very transactional, obviously, and he can never quite get over the fact that the majority of American Jews don't prioritize Israel as an issue, and therefore will never vote for him, or the majority are unlikely to ever vote for him. But I think that is the point. This war has to be finished if there is to be any hope for anybody's idea of peace and security for Israel or the Palestinians or anybody else. And yet, so much of our discourse about the war has now just focused on, stop the shooting, something that basically leaves a really bad actor, an evil regime, a genocidal force in place. And it seems no one is really thinking about the consequences of that, except the people who really hate Israel.
Now, I did a Washington Post show a week ago, Jonathan, and Jonathan Capehart is the host. And he seemed a little bit stunned by my bluntness. There are between 5,000 and 10,000 killers in Rafah, dead, stone-cold killers who would kill you and me and everyone listening to this podcast. They would kill us, and they would think they had done a good thing. And Israel cannot leave 5,000 to 10,000 heavily armed killers in Rafah, or they will take control of Gaza again, and they will begin a replay. And this time, they'll figure out a way to get a dirty bomb. This time, they'll try and figure out something else, because as Aviv Reddick-Gur repeatedly says, their goal is to drive the colonizers out of Israel. They don't understand Israel is actually the first successful anti-colonial project of post-World War II. The colonizers were the British Mandate, and the British Mandate had to be defeated by a combination of the three groups that made up the pre-statehood resistance. They were expelled. So Israel isn't a colonizer. Aviv likes to point out they're not going anywhere. They have nowhere to go. And until and unless the people who believe that Israel can be destroyed are gone from Gaza, they can't stop the war.
Yeah, I think that's entirely right. And it's a pity there isn't more moral clarity, such as you just articulated, in our discussions in this country about the war. But let me switch slightly to another aspect of U.S.-Israel relations, and that is the question of American military aid to Israel, which on the one hand, Biden has been threatening to cut it off, which is a very serious problem for Israel because, it is largely dependent, almost completely dependent on American arms and armaments and supplies to continue fighting and to defend itself against Iran. And yet Biden does want an Israel aid package, but he's tied it to a much larger allocation, maybe 4 times as much aid to Ukraine in one package. And I think largely because he thinks that was the only way to pass the Ukraine aid package that he wanted. I guess let's start by saying, and many people, including some friends of both of us, believe these two conflicts are about the same things and that it's sort of a general war for democracy. Do you see it in that simply? Should these two conflicts, be linked in terms of American aid?
Yes, and so should Taiwan. My worldview is that there are good guys and bad guys. And the bad guys are led by China, with Russia and Iran as their partners. It's like a law firm. I'm a lawyer. I'm not practicing anymore. The managing partner is China. The senior partners with the biggest books of business are Russia and Iran. The junior partners are Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea. And then they have a bunch of associates, and some are associates, and they're scattered around the world. Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas. And on the other side is another law firm that has no idea that there's a competition in town that intends to destroy them. And we're kind of living in a world that refuses. Now, I lived through the 80s, and I was in the Reagan White House, and the nuclear freeze movement had the same problem. Jeane Kirkpatrick made the same argument. There's a difference between them and us. And there's some people in between. We're not sure where they are. They have to worry about, they're very close to China. But Vietnam and India are on our side. Japan is on our side. Taiwan is on our side. Australia is on our side. But there's also a guy who attacked a priest with a knife in Australia this week. So there are fanatics everywhere, even down under. And until and unless we get a grip on this, we're not going to have a coherent foreign policy. I don't know that the only time I've ever interviewed Joe Biden, Jonathan, was outside of an AIPAC meeting. I spoke to AIPAC, so I put a studio. I didn't do it. People with technical skills did it. But I was interviewing people coming and going. And Joe Biden, then Senator Biden, was very proud to be at AIPAC. Very strong. That's his 8-track tape. Stand with Israel. Stand with Israel. Stand with Israel. For a reason he may never have actually thought through, because I don't think even at his best, Joe Biden was ever that sharp. He was never Richard Nixon sharp. He was never Bill Clinton sharp. And I don't know where the former President Obama is on the sharpness scale. Certainly, President Biden was not that good as any of these people, and age is a factor here. So we have a very confused presidency and a couple of people around him who just want to get through it. I think they want to go back to Brookings. They want to make some money. I don't even think they'd mind that much if they lose. Wendy Sherman quit. Wendy Sherman, the day before Iran attacked, or actually 3 days before Iran attacked, said Israel is better than the way they're conducting this war. Wendy Sherman is a social worker who has gotten everything wrong in her life. And I really doubt if you said, tell me about the Melian dialogue, she'd have any idea what we're talking about. And so it's one of my little tests that I run with people on air to find out, do you have any idea what you're talking about? Now, you're a history guy at Columbia. If we talk about Napoleon in a battle here, you'll get an idea of where we are, or you'll figure it out as we talk. I think some of these people are just stone cold ignorant of national security history. They wouldn't even, some people, my favorite trick, Jonathan, this will, to your listeners outside of the country, will make no sense. I asked first-time guests on my show, was Algeria a communist spy? And I do that primarily to know if they have any idea who Hiss is. And if they don't, I know I'm dealing with someone who is not well-read. They might be smart, but they're ignorant of American national security history. And so I adjust as a result. A lot of these people in the White House, not Jake Sullivan, he's allegedly once-in-a-generation intellect, not Tony Blinken. We have mutual friends. He's very smart. But the junior staff, Admiral Kirby, very smart. Karine Jean-Pierre, don't think she's done the homework. And there are a lot of people who are not going to win the spelling bee. The vice president is not going to win the spelling bee. A lot of people in the Democratic coalition in Congress are not going to win the spelling bee. And sometimes I just want them to read anything. Are you familiar with Daniel Gordis and his?
Oh, yes.
All right. So I like his book, Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. And I give it to people who are in first or second grade on world history. I said, read this, get at least 100 years of figuring out where Israel came from and who started it and who Herzl is. And until and unless you get that, I can't talk to you. Because if you're going to be as dumb as a brick, and we have some of those in Congress, in my party too. All right, so we've got some dumb as a brick people in my party. They're opposing aid to Ukraine. They're opposing aid to Israel, a couple people. So they're dumb as a brick. What are we going to do? We have to get a coalition of the willingly well-read to pass these things.
Okay, well, I do know the Million Dialogue, and I do know that Alger Hiss was a communist.
Well, I knew you did.
Was right. But let's talk for a minute about the Russia-Ukraine war. Obviously, it's many people are convinced that Putin's Russia. You referenced the 1980s, that Putin's Russia is, in a sense, as much of a threat as the Soviet Union was to the United States. Where does this war go? I mean, I understand, Hamas, when we speak of Israel's war against Hamas, that's a clear objective. Israel can defeat Hamas. That's something I can explain to people. I can see what the end game is. What is the end game in Ukraine? And I guess to sort of, obviously I agree with you. There are many dumb people in the Republican Party and some of them perhaps are among those who are the skeptics of what they perceive as a blank check to Ukraine. But what do you see as the end game for the United States in this war, or in Russia, Ukraine? How does that get resolved?
I have pushed a lot of smart people in the Republican Party on this, and it's a political vulnerability because the ignorant caucus is powerful and they will run people against them in the primary, and not just now, but down the road, if they vote for a big package for Ukraine. I agree with the Cotton solution. Senator Cotton wants to only send weapons, only weapons. We don't want to pay for your pensions. We don't want to pay for your rebuild. We're not into that. That's Western Europe's problem. Send weapons. And by the way, rebuild our industrial debates and defense industrial debates at the same time. It is, to me, the 80% solution. We're not going to help them rebuild their electric power grid, and we're not going to reopen their nuclear power plant that Russia has destroyed. But the end game is the same end game as when Ronald Reagan started Charlie Wilson's war, as long as it takes to wear them down. And they will eventually stop. And Ukraine, I don't think they'll run out of people before Russia does. It's a horrific war. The fellow that in School of War today was talking about how badly, the chief correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, how bad the casualty count is. It's horrific. He compared it to our Korean War in 2 years as opposed to 5. And so it's grinding through Ukrainians at a terrible pace, and Russia's got more people. So I don't know if Russia can outlast them, but we have got to stay as long as they're willing to fight. Nobody asked the Mujahideen, how long are we going to send weapons to the Mujahideen for? Nobody in my White House years ever said, gosh, how long are we going to do this? As long as we were killing Soviets and trying to take over Afghanistan, and we're in Korea 55, 60 years after the fighting. It's longer now, isn't it? 75 years probably since we left Korea, and we're still there. We don't ever stop if we want to win. I don't want my grandkids to be citizens of a second-rate power with a third-rate economy. And if you don't want that, you've got to stay there as long as it takes.
Okay. Is the goal, I mean, Zelensky's goal is sort of the reconstitution of Ukraine as it was in 2014. Do you think that's an achievable goal?
I don't. I'm not even sure it makes a lot of sense. The Crimea was actually part of Russia. And I like to point out to people, the Crimean War was fought against Russia because Crimea was part of Russia and Ukraine was not. So there is a line there that history.
Yeah, and I think the indigenous people of Crimea were actually Tartars, not Ukrainians or Russians.
You are right. You are right. But it was, what did Khrushchev...
remnants of which were forcibly evicted by Stalin.
Right. And didn't Khrushchev, quote, give Crimea to Ukraine as in one of his moving around the little lines within the Soviet Union? I don't know where that line is, but it is certainly not what Putin crossed in 2 years ago. 2 years ago, he crossed the line that had settled, and we got to get him back across that line, or at least stand on that line by the West providing the weapons and the Ukrainians providing the manpower. Because I don't see how the NATO avoids a bigger conflict if they don't stop Putin now.
Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure that we're where we were in 1987 with the forces of the Warsaw Pact, but obviously there needs to be some settlement there that precludes any further Russian aggression, for sure.
Yeah, and an off-ramp that doesn't require Putin to bow and scrape. There is, what did Nixon write in The Real War? Always leave your opponent an exit. And so we haven't left him an exit at this point, but we don't want to leave him an exit from a position of weakness. I didn't know this until fairly recently, but Team Biden did not provide Ukraine with what they asked for until grudgingly and very late. And remember their big offensive in the first year of the war when they took back a third of what they had lost? Had they had the weapons they have now, they could have done more. And so this never escalate, the minimum amount of force that drives Team Biden is a recipe for disaster.
I guess one aspect of this that I think should trouble everybody, no matter where they come down on any of these issues, is can America be involved in this many conflicts simultaneously, or do we have to choose? A lot of this is about, our ability to produce weapons. The Ukrainian war is kind of like World War I. If you know your World War I history, it sounds like 1915 and the Allied shell shortage, because it's like trench warfare and they're using so many artillery shells and they want, they need more air defense, but the United States isn't producing enough for them, let alone to give Israel what it needs and depends upon, let alone what Taiwan needs. If it's going to be a hard target for China, obviously, I think there's some consensus that the United States has to start producing more weapons, but can we possibly ramp up to the point where we can support all these conflicts in a way that deters, future aggression?
Of course we can. The question is, will we? Arthur Herman's great book on the Arsenal of Democracy. The moment the United States decides to produce weapons, we produce a lot of weapons. We have not come to that moment. Yesterday, Team Biden announced that they were giving billions to a semiconductor manufacturer in either Texas or Arizona. I think that's great. We need semiconductors. They make everything work. We don't have enough graving.
And they're currently all being produced in Taiwan, which makes it.
Right. And so if they take Taiwan and blow that up, the world kind of stops and our economy collapses. But we can't even produce 2 Virginia-class submarines a year in the United States, much less meet the Australian need, because we took the peace dividend. We thought it was real. We ran with it. We shuttered shipyards. We condensed the defense industry. And I would rather begin now to reopen the defense industry and expand the weaponry purchases than waiting until we're in a hot conflict with Taiwan. Because if you're Xi Jinping and you're looking at the map, or what they used to say, the correlation of forces, we're old enough to remember the correlation of forces.
And both of us
never
never
Yeah, there's never been more on his side. So the people who are older who can remember the Cold War stuff, been forgotten since '89. We got to get back in that and figure it out. And it's hard to do with Fox over here and MSNBC over here and nobody talking to each other. It's very hard to do. Israel, by the way, is the one place where 80% of Americans talk the same language. Not the far right, not the far left, but 80% say, yeah, that's a Democratic ally. That is our land-based aircraft carrier in the Middle East, and we're going to stand by them. I don't really think that's frayed, and I really don't think the Squad or any of these extremists in New York or Chicago or LA this week, I don't think they represent even a tenth of the American Muslim community. They're radicals. They're the SDS of today, and we just have to put them aside and ignore them because they don't represent anything. And Biden is afraid of them. He shouldn't be electorally, but as many people say, he's not very good at this.
Yeah. Thanks, because that takes me back to where I wanted to go with the U.S.-Israel relationship. What do you think of Biden and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer's attempts to back what can only be called regime change in Jerusalem? Why do you think they're out to oust Prime Minister Netanyahu? Is this about Iran? Is it about Michigan? Because a lot of Democrats speak as if, they think that Biden has to beat Netanyahu before he can beat Trump. That doesn't make much sense to me. But what is the goal there?
Jonathan, you'll have to tell me. I don't understand Israeli politics. I talk to Michael Oren at least once a week from Jerusalem. I talk to Aviv. I talk to Dan Senor. I talk to everyone who will try and explain, to John Podhoretz, to Seth Mandel. There are too many parties and too many players, and everybody thinks Netanyahu is the most hawkish man in America, and he's not. He's actually one of the most cautious people in the world. I interviewed Bibi when his book came out before he became prime minister again, and I read his book. I said, he really has never taken the wind-up pitch and thrown it at a batter's head. He has never done that. Mow the grass is not what we're doing in Gaza right now. And I read, and it rang true, that on Saturday night, Gantz wanted to go to war immediately and wanted to hit Iran. And Netanyahu said, no. Let's analyze this. I think he is a simple totem for the Democratic base, that if you're against Bibi, that's enough to get enough of your traditional Jewish American voter to stick with you if you're against Bibi, but don't be against Israel, be against Bibi. I don't think that's working. I don't do the polling. I'm an Irish Catholic American, so I don't really know much about the Jewish political mindset. And my Sherpas in that world just tell me it's always been less than 30% of Jewish Americans vote Republican. And I don't expect that to change unless they are driven out by Joe Biden. And he's doing a pretty good imitation of driving them out.
Yeah, well, I think anti-Semitism, which is at a peak, is having more influence on changing at least some Jewish votes this year than anything else. Now, our two main political parties, Democrats and Republicans, have, in my view, exchanged identities on Israel in the last, say, 60 years, where Democrats used to be a more lockstep pro-Israel party. The Republicans were divided. Today, it's the opposite. The GOP is the pro-Israel party, and the Democrats are at best divided, and if you listen to some people, an anti-Israel party. And is that, as some on the left think, Israel's fault? And how much of a role do you think sort of what we call, for lack of a better term, woke ideology, like critical race theory and intersectionality, have played in changing so many Democrats on Israel?
Woke ideology are the termites in the West, and it takes a long time for them to eat away at the wood, and then the wood collapses. And so when 10/7 happened, we had that moment of clarity. The window of clarity opened, and Republicans said, see, we told you. And Democrats said, yeah, you're right. Not maybe out loud, but they said, oh my God, this is so horrific. We've got to rally around Israel. Did not take even a week before the hard left came out. Now, I had Secretary Clinton on the show after she lost. I asked her how many stone cold racists there were in America on the right. We agreed. Less than 500,000, 600,000 max, something like that. There are a lot more people of the left than there are stone cold racists. People on the left are into the oppressed ideology, and they've gotten their history wrong. They think Israel is an oppressor because enough people have said it long enough that they believe it, and it's simply not true. They don't know about the mandate. They don't know about the Balfour Declaration. They don't know anything about anything. So you can't persuade them otherwise. But I think those Democratic voters who are Jewish, who have always voted Democratic, they have got to look at the reality of the world today and decide that it is not an option to be a Democrat anymore. They just have to decide that they have to be a Republican. And they're going to hate it because it's Trump, right? They're not going to want to do it. If we had W or we had a nice, even Ron DeSantis, certainly if they had Nikki Haley, she would win this in 15, walking away. But they're getting Trump. So they're forced to the choice. And you say moral clarity, and they're going to say, Donald Trump's a horrible person. He's not really. He's just like everybody else. He's a developer. And he had a checkered personal life. And some people don't like him for that. But when it comes to who does he have? Because you don't vote for one person. You vote for 3,000 people. You know this. I know this. And I think most of our listeners. I'm voting for not only Donald Trump, but for Mike Pompeo and Robert O'Brien and a serious Secretary of Defense like Tom Cotton or a serious Attorney General like Ted Cruz. And they might not like any of these people. But if their number one issue is moral clarity, I don't think they have a choice in November. They've got to rebuke the Democratic Party the way that Clinton did in the primaries of 92.
How much of a role do you think foreign policy will play in this election in 2024? Traditionally, foreign policy doesn't decide American elections. But is this a year where it will? I mean, certainly Biden is acting as if it will because he seems to be so afraid of the left wing of his Democratic Party that, that he's pivoted on Israel in a very important way, and even to the point where he has really backed up some of the calumnies against Israel in its campaign against Hamas.
What he had.
It's going to last, or is it going to be about something else?
It'll be mostly about inflation because people who don't tune in, never listen to me, never listen to you. People who don't tune in are paying gas and they're paying food bills and they don't like Joe Biden. His approval rating, I mean, no president has ever won re-election with this approval rating. But if it's as close as I think it will be in some states, this will indeed be the deciding, it was 17,000 votes or something like that would have flipped the election to Trump in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Arizona. It's not that many people changing sides. Maybe Georgia's in that mix. Maybe it's 70,000. I can't remember. It's very close election.
43,000 votes in 3 states.
Okay. So we got to change 22,000 minds. Are there 22,000 Americans who will vote national security? Yes. Mostly in the military. I've got a son, a son-in-law, and a nephew on active duty, and I do not want President Biden to be their commander-in-chief.
Well, I guess the question, certainly the Democrats seem to be staking the election on is one of democracy. And it kind of goes to what you said about sort of the non-Trumps among Republicans. And I think Trump supporters would say that if DeSantis or Nikki Haley or, any other Republican were the nominee, they would be, libeled and smeared just as Trump has been. That's just the nature of American politics in the 21st century. What do you, and so is this about democracy? And what do you think is going to happen if Trump wins? Because it doesn't seem as if either side is open to the idea that they could lose fairly.
I think most people are open to that idea. I knew the result on election night, and I wrote about it on election morning, and I wish Trump had been reelected. So I think most Americans do get it, and I don't watch MSNBC for the reason that they don't. I do think the president watches Morning Joe and turns on MSNBC at night, and a lot of his news comes through that. He gets a daily briefing, and it might go in, but the pictures are what he sees on MSNBC, and he hates Trump, and he thinks it's about Trump, and he thinks it's about democracy. I don't. I think it's nuts. That's crazy. We have a very strong Constitution. When I used to be a lawyer, I still teach common law, but I don't practice law anymore. The Constitution is very strong. If Mike Pence had put the votes aside, which he didn't do because it was not constitutional, the Supreme Court would have told him to count them the next day. It's not that there was not going to be a coup. The military was not in the street. It's all silly. What's not silly is 10-7. What's not silly is Ukraine. What isn't silly is Abbeygate and the fact that the women of Afghanistan went back to a pre-9/11 state. None of that is silly. Charges that democracy are threatening the United States is deeply silly. It's not. the ideology of the left has become very troublesome. My alma maters, Harvard and Michigan, are both broken. They're badly, badly broken. There's a lot of repair work to be done, but we'll get it done, provided we can get serious again. And I think maybe podcasting is what's going to renew America. And I used to think blogging would, because it broke the media monopoly, but media figured out online pretty quickly. Podcasting is what media used to be. It's a serious conversation among people, often at different points of view, that goes on at length for serious people. And serious people run the country in the final analysis. And we can't be run by MSNBC or by Fox after 7 because it's ideology, right? There are facts, and we need to stay focused on it. I'm actually kind of optimistic that this election is going to sort serious people from unserious people. If I test one thing out on you, Jonathan, I think there's a 4-square box: smart and ignorant, powerful and without power. The smart people without power are angry all the time because they look over and they see ignorant people with power and they wonder why. And the smart people without power get angry and they go to the streets and they support people who are in the streets. And I just think that the other 3 boxes are going to shut them down in this election cycle. I have to believe that, because I think Americans support Israel. I think we support Zelensky and freedom fighters. I think we regret Abbey Gate and that we could have stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years with 2,500 Americans and 2,500 NATO and down to Korea from Kabul north. I do think we are aware of the threat. Do you think we're aware of the threat to the West?
I think some of us are. I see a lot of people out there who aren't. At times it seems as if the future of the Democratic Party is in that category. We'll see. Obviously, I think this election is also hinging on other issues, like basically, as my friend Batya Ungar Sargon says, the conflict between the credentialed elites and working class Americans. I think that's playing a large role in giving Trump a much better chance of winning in this election than he had than he had the last time. So it's not clear to me how that's going to sort itself out. And I also worry that we have escalated our political warfare to the point, and we're speaking in a week when, for the first time in our history, a former president is going on trial in a criminal case, which seems to be a complete, completely trumped up, you should pardon the pun, case with no merit whatsoever. And I worry that in the long run, it just means that we're welcome to a banana republic, because if Democrats are going to do that, Republicans will pay them back.
That which gets rewarded gets repeated. And we are rewarding Alvin Bragg with Alvin Bragg is not a good prosecutor. It's a bad case. Trump's vulnerability is with the documents case, not what he kept, but the subpoena he did not respond to. And every serious lawyer I know believes that his greatest vulnerability is on the obstruction of justice charge, as it was with RN 50 years ago. And the question becomes, did he obstruct justice or not? I haven't heard his defense, so I don't have an opinion on it yet. I think Jack Smith's case in D.C. is weak, and certainly he's lost before at the Supreme Court. I believe Fani Willis's case is weak and it's fallen apart. It should be on the case. And Alvin Bragg is light years worse than that. Light years. Andy McCarthy and the McCarthy Report, anyone who doubts it, serious prosecutor, Southern District of New York, brought down the blind shake. He knows his stuff. I'm a civil lawyer. I was a justice for a year and the White House for a couple of years, and I know my way around crimes, but I don't litigate them, and I have never prosecuted anyone. Andy is convinced this is just a nonsense case, and I believe that will backfire on Democrats. More to the point, though, it's all going to be over in 4 more years. I'm going to stay on the radio at least till 2029 because I want to know how the show ends. But Biden and Trump, both of them will be done within 4 years. That's like that. What comes after that? The Democratic Party are they going to really nominate Kamala Harris? Really? And who is Trump going to pick as his running mate? Most important question in the future of American politics right now is who's the running mate? I'm a big fan of Cotton, big fan of Pompeo, maybe Joni Ernst. I know Doug Burgum is rising for a lot of different reasons because he appeals to the to the small man who made it big in America. That's Doug Burgum's story from the heartland, rural America. So those four, I'll take any of them. I'll take any of them to turn the page. Doug Burgum's a little bit old, but not old. But compared to Biden and Trump, he's not. My age.
Well, I guess, you've kind of answered my next question, but I'll pose it to you anyway. Are you optimistic about America? I think that's the question I keep asking, a lot of my guests. Are you optimistic about the future despite all the horrible things that we're living through right now?
I am, because I have family in the military, and I've had friends in the military. I'm a civilian. I always make sure people understand that. I don't know port from starboard. I don't know anything. But what my kids have taught me is that it's an extraordinary group of people, and our next greatest generation is beginning to appear. Now, I'm sorry Mike Gallagher's retiring, but I don't think he's leaving forever. Cotton is there. Mike Waltz is there. There are serious combat veterans of the long war who are rising up in American politics, and the feckless generation, which is my generation, the boomer. I was born in 1956. It's the easiest year. That makes me 68 for listeners. They don't have to do the math. The easiest year to ever be born is 1956. I mean, transgressive humor was laughing in the Smothers Brothers. That was out there stuff. You were safe. You could go to Harvard and be Jewish and not get assaulted. And I lived with Jewish kids at Harvard, and they didn't worry about getting beat up on the way to class. There weren't any. I guess there were anti-apartheid demonstrations in the late 70s at Harvard. And Michigan was about as boring a place as you go to law school, and they didn't have this craziness that happened to Dan Senor, of all people, this week. Dan, I just can't believe what's happened to academia, but this group isn't going to put up with it, and they're not going to put up with elites telling them that up is down and left is right, and that Israel is a bad guy. They're not going to put up with it.
Well, I hope you're right. You think so much.
What do you think?
Well, what do I think? I believe in America. In the end, that sounds like that's the opening line from The Godfather, right? But I do believe in America. I believe in American exceptionalism. I believe American exceptionalism is under siege right now. And that relates to Jewish security, because Jews have been safe and secure in a way that they have never been anywhere else because of American exceptionalism. And I think if the woke tide is not rolled back, because it has taken over so much of our society, then that exceptionalism is in danger, and then it's hard to be optimistic. But I have to believe that in the long run it will be rolled back, and that that America will survive. And I have no doubts about Israel surviving as well. But that's a different kind of optimism.
We agree, Jonathan. We agree on both points.
You, thanks so much for joining us today. And thanks for your insights. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story, click on the bell for notifications, and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. One programming note, we'll be off the next 2 weeks for Passover, although the daily podcasts will continue. So our next video program will air on May 9th. Until then, we want to wish all of you a very happy and healthy Passover. Chag Pesach Sameach. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon.